Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brilliance of the Mongol Empire built by Genghis Khan, the man who rose from a kidnapped orphan with trust issues to the leader of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just woken up somewhere near the Onan River. You're wrapped in wool that smells like a damp yak. The sun hasn't risen, and neither has your sense of direction. There's frost on your boots, a thin layer of ice in your nose, and the sound of something snorting far too close to your head. It's your horse. Of course it is. He's your bedmate, your ride, your heating system, and occasionally your lunch. Personal space is not a concept here. He breathes heavily on you and steps on your coat while you try to stand. He does not apologize. Mongol horses never apologize. Your camp is already in motion. No one speaks. They just mount up and ride off like smoke. A boy with a bow the length of his body gallops past you, yawning. He looks about 10. His saddle is older than he is. He's been riding longer than you've been conscious. You tighten your sash, pack your gear, and climb onto your horse. There's no stirrup ceremony, no deep breath of gratitude, no breakfast. You chew dried meat while riding. If your jaw isn't strong, it will be by tomorrow. Assuming there is a tomorrow, the wind cuts sideways. It's not wind for decoration. It's the kind that flays the unprepared. You're riding into it at full gallop. Your face goes numb by the third ridge. No one notices. No one asks if you're okay. This is the step. You are either riding or you are part of the landscape. By midday, you've switched horses twice. Not because you're tired. The horses. You're expected to be harder than your animal. If the horse is struggling, you carry more. This is considered balance. You urinate from horseback. You eat from horseback. You fight from horseback. If you fall off, you will be trampled. If you stop moving, you will be left. If you complain, no one will listen. They'll just assume the wolves got you early. You ride because everyone rides. Because there are no roads, no destinations, only speed and survival. And because in the Mongol Empire, walking is for prisoners. And you are not a prisoner yet. You've survived the ride. You're not dead. That's good. But now you're hungry, which is a shame because breakfast here isn't a meal. It's a dare. Someone hands you a leather sack. It sloshes. That's your morning beverage. Fermented mare's milk. It's white, sour, slightly fizzy, and smells like what a saddle feels like after 3 weeks of riding through war zones. You drink it anyway, not because you want to. Because that's what there is. It's called arag. It's technically alcoholic, but not the fun kind of alcohol. The kind that reminds you bacteria are real, and they live in your throat. Now, Mongol children drink this. So do warriors. So do grandmothers. If it burns going down, that's how you know it's working. Food. There might be a hunk of dried mutton. Maybe it's gray, shriveled, and so tough you could use it to resolve your boots. You chew it for 20 minutes. It doesn't get smaller, it just becomes wetter. There's also some curd, a rock-hard, sun-dried dairy lump that could double as a projectile weapon. It tastes like sour dust, feels like gravel, and makes your teeth question their purpose. You consider crying, but your tears freeze before they fall. You sit on the ground because there are no tables, no chairs, no napkins, just wind, wool, and the distinct scent of someone boiling something with hooves in it. There are no forks, no spoons, just your hands and the silent judgment of the old man across from you who's already finished his meal, tied a new knot in his saddle rope, and is now sharpening a blade with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious experiences. You eat what's given. You don't ask what it is. That's a good way to stop being given food. There's no chatting. Mongols don't waste time with pleasantries before battle or after or during meals. They eat like they ride. Fast, quiet, and prepared to move at any moment. You try to match their pace. You fail. The mutton fights back. You're not full. You're not satisfied. But you're slightly less starving. And in the Mongol Empire, that's a win. It's mid-morning now. The horses are sweating. So are you. And you may be wondering, when do you wash? You don't. In the Mongol Empire, clean is not about soap or baths. It's about not dying from infection, and even that's negotiable. You smell like leather, horse, meat smoke, and the faint sourness of whatever your boots are made from. Everyone else does too. No one comments. If you show up smelling like flowers, you're either a spy or cursed. Possibly. Both. Water is for drinking, not bathing. You want to scrub yourself clean with river water? That's drinking water. You want to die of dysentery with soft skin? Go ahead. Otherwise, wipe your face with your sleeve and move on. There is no soap. There is animal fat. There is ash. There is sand. If you want to exfoliate, rub your face with a handful of dust and pretend it's a spa. Your hands are filthy. Your nails are weapons. Your hair hasn't seen water in months, but it's tied neatly under your cap because appearance still matters. Just not the clean kind, the greasy kind that's respected. You don't remove lice. You manage them. You name them. You flick them into the fire during evening conversation. If they bite too much, you smear yourself with animal fat and dare them to keep going. Clothing. It's wool. It's stiff. It's been worn for 3 winters and still has blood on it from a goat you vaguely remember arguing with. You don't change it. You layer it. Add more in winter. Peel it off in summer. Maybe underwear doesn't exist. Neither does shame. And your teeth, they are your own problem. No brushes, no rinses, you chew bones, you drink air rag. You hope the acidity of your breakfast slowly dissolves whatever stuck between your murs. You keep a knife handy, not for enemies, but for when that one tooth decides it's done being in your head. So, no, you don't get a bath. You get wind. You get horse sweat. You get an overwhelming bouquet of unwashed humanity. But look on the bright side. No one else can smell you over themselves. Now that you've unlearned everything you knew about hygiene, It's time to ride into your first skirmish. You ride all morning and into the afternoon. You are not told where you're going. You are simply going. And then you see them, a cluster of moving dots on the horizon. Riders like you, but not like you. Because they're not here to share fermented milk and stories. They're here to die, or make you die. It's flexible. You don't panic. No one panics. Everyone just reaches for their bow. Mongol bows are short, curved, deadly, and somehow heavier than they look. They're made from layers of horn, sinew, and raw intent. They don't forgive mistakes. They don't miss twice. You notch your arrow. Your horse keeps moving. You don't slow down. That would be embarrassing. You twist at the waist, lean into the wind, and loose. It flies. So does theirs. Welcome to Mongol warfare. No glorious sword fights. No chivalrous jewels. Just arrows. Constant, intelligent, unromantic arrows fired from impossible distances while galloping. You've barely blinked, and 3 of your enemies are already on the ground. 2 more are riding in the wrong direction, possibly reconsidering their entire lifestyle. The trick is movement, always moving. The enemy tries to close in. You retreat, not in fear, but on purpose. The famous feigned retreat. Let them think you're running. Let them chase. Then turn around and shoot them in the face. You're part of a dance. Fast, precise, brutal. There's no shouting, no battle cries. Just the snap of bowstrings and the dull thud of impact. You hear a scream. It's short. You don't look back. Your arrows aren't just sharp. They're poisoned. It's not personal. It's practical. Wound one enemy and let his comrades waste time dragging him away. Wound 2 and you've stalled their entire flank. Efficiency is more important than honor. You've now fired maybe 50 arrows. You've lost count. That's fine. There's a bag of 70 more hanging from your saddle. You shoot until your fingers blister. Then shoot anyway, because if you stop, you won't have fingers. By sunset, the battle is done. You don't know how many you killed. No one does. No one's counting. Only one thing matters. You're still riding. You don't celebrate. You wipe your blade. You eat. You sleep. And tomorrow, you ride again. The battle's over. The sun dips behind the hills. No singing, no parades, just a crackling fire and the subtle sound of something being dismembered nearby. Dinner. You're expected to eat what you kill. If you didn't kill anything today, don't worry. Someone did. You just have to help prepare it. That means skinning, slicing, searing, or occasionally stabbing the goat again because it's somehow still twitching. The meat is tough. Of course it is. It's from an animal that spent its entire life walking uphill in a snowstorm. You roast it on an iron spit that's been in the family longer than most family members. There are no spices, no salt, no ceremony. If it bleeds less than you, it's ready. You sit in a circle, chewing quietly. Everyone stares into the fire like it owes them money. A warrior beside Yuner, a rib clean, licks the bone, then throws it behind him like it might grow into another goat. The fat is the best part. It's greasy, rich, and absolutely essential to staying alive. Mongols prize fat, above all, not for flavor, but because it sticks to your ribs and keeps your soul from freezing. At night, you don't question it. You bite into it like it wronged your ancestors. There's no bread, no vegetables, just meat and dairy and something in a wooden bowl that might be soup or might be regret. If someone hands you a chunk of organ meat, you take it. You eat it. You do not ask what it was in life. Curiosity is a luxury. You are not a noble. You are not a guest. You are a stomach with legs and a knife. After eating, there is no cleanup. The bones go to the dogs, the ashes to the wind. You wipe your hands on your cloak, which also doubles as a napkin, towel, and winter blanket. Hygiene is still theoretical. Someone belches. This is considered polite. You do it too. Congratulations. You're adapting. Later, when you lie in your felt-wrapped bedroll beside a snoring horse, you'll dream of meat because that's what tomorrow holds too. And if it doesn't, you'll have to ride further until it does. There's no announcement. No first snowflake drifting poetically from the sky. One night you're sleeping with your boots off. The next your boots are frozen solid, and so is your will to live. Welcome to winter on the steppe. It doesn't get cold. It becomes cold. A creeping, bone-deep, cruel cold that wraps around your ribs and whispers, "You were never meant to be here." The wind doesn't howl, it bites. It has teeth and they're sharp, and they aim for your ears. Your breath turns to fog, then to ice, then to regret. You sleep with your horse now, not near your horse, with your horse. You press your back against its side like it's a lover made of hay and muscle. You'd say it's awkward, but at least it's warm. Clothing becomes a game of layers. Wool over leather over fur. You stop feeling your fingers by mid-morning. You stop feeling your toes the day after. You try not to think about it. If they come back, great. If not, fewer things to stub. There's no firewood, no forests, just frozen dung. You burn it without question. It smells like betrayal, but it's heat. The smoke curls around your face and makes your eyes water. You blink and your eyelashes freeze together. You are now part sculpture. Your water ice, your food ice, your nose bleeding, you ride anyway. Mongols don't stop for weather. If it's not an arrow or a plague, it's not worth mentioning. You ride with snow in your boots and wind in your bones, and nobody cares, especially not the horses who seem to enjoy it. The cold changes you. It takes your voice, dries your skin, and rewrites your personality to something quieter, stiffer, and much less optimistic. You stop complaining, not out of stoicism, but because your jaw refuses to move. And yet, you keep moving, because if you stop, you'll freeze. And if you freeze, someone will bury you under a can of stones and ride off without breaking stride. The Empire doesn't wait for spring. Neither do you. He doesn't look like a legend. He sits cross-legged on a plain wooden platform, chewing a piece of dried meat with all the ceremony of a bored butcher. His fur-lined coat is weather-beaten. His beard is uneven. His boots have blood on them, though whether it's from battle, a goat, or last week's argument with a tax collector is unclear. This is your Khan, your general, your leader, the man who can order entire cities wiped from the map with a raised eyebrow. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make eye contact for too long. You definitely do not correct his pronunciation. Even if he calls you that one with the hair for 6 months straight, he speaks softly. Mongol leaders don't shout. If you can't hear him, that's your problem. Listen harder, or read his tone, or follow the sound of your own heartbeat because it's now louder than his voice. Orders are short, precise, absolute. Ride here. Burn this. Accept tribute. Behead the messenger. Don't return until it's done. You nod. Everyone nods. Even the tough ones. The warriors who once outran a siege fire nod like nervous schoolchildren. One man coughs during the briefing. He is now gone. No one mentions him again. Your Khan doesn't care about your feelings. He cares about results. Did the city fall? Did you bring back tribute? Is the caravan moving? Are the horses fed? If the answer to any of these is no, you'd better be holding your severed arm as an excuse. His tent is not lavish, but it holds maps. So many maps, all hand-drawn, all annotated in a scroll that looks like a falcon learned calligraphy. You understand none of it. He understands all of it. He sees rivers as roads, mountains as slight inconveniences, and kingdoms as small prizes wrapped in bad diplomacy. You receive your orders. You leave. You do not ask questions. You do not linger. You saddle your horse, and you ride out into the cold again. Because in the Mongol Empire, leadership is not about charisma. It's about survival. And those who question the Khan rarely get the chance to do it twice. You ride into a foreign land carrying a message. You are not a soldier today. You are an ambassador. This does not mean you are safe. You ride with a small entourage, a flag of truce, and the smug confidence of someone who knows that behind you are thousands of warriors who will happily burn an entire civilization to the ground if your letter is not well received. The letter itself is simple, direct, a few short lines scrolled in Mongolian, Persian, maybe Chinese, depending on the poor soul receiving it. It reads something like, "Submit to us, or don't. We'll be back either way." It's sealed, with the Khan's mark, a bit of hardened wax that might as well be soaked in gasoline, considering what follows a refusal. You ride into cities with marble gates, golden domes, silk curtains, and nervous guards. You are fed. You are questioned. You are stared at like a hungry wolf that's somehow been invited to dinner. You are polite. You are calm. You explain slowly that submission is in everyone's best interest. Mongol protection comes with benefits, trade, order, slightly fewer massacres. Refusal comes with fire, arrows, and a thorough removal of anything shaped like a building. Sometimes they say yes. They offer tribute, horses, gold, daughters. You nod. You leave. You report back. That city stays standing for now. Sometimes they hesitate. They whisper behind closed doors. They send you back with vague answers and suspiciously generous gifts. You accept them. You smile. You note everything. And sometimes they kill the messenger. This is unfortunate for them. You are not avenged with a complaint. You are avenged with siege. Engines, horse archers, psychological warfare, and a creative use of severed heads as decorative warning signs. Diplomacy is fast in the Mongol Empire. One message, one chance, no second letters, no passive-aggressive negotiations. You deliver the will of the Khan. If it's ignored, his reply arrives strapped to the back of 40 zero-mounted archers and a few very enthusiastic engineers. You don't argue. You don't negotiate. You deliver. And if the world listens, it lives. You've ridden into what passes for a Mongol capital. You are expecting to maybe walls, some kind of palace with polished floors and a guy in a hat offering figs. What you find instead is a swarm of yurts, felt domes, dozens, hundreds. They stretch across the plains like mushrooms after rain. No stone, no marble, just wool, smoke, and the smell of boiled something. This is Karakoram, the capital, the beating heart of an empire that spans from the Korean peninsula to the edge of Europe. And it looks like someone lost a sheep convention in the wind. But make no mistake, it functions. Yurts aren't huts, they're portable command centers. Every single one can be taken down in an hour and rebuilt by nightfall. You can burn a city. You can't burn something that's already gone by morning. The Khan's yurt is larger than the rest. Its doorway faces south. Always. You do not enter without invitation. Inside there's felt, furs, scrolls, and a throne that looks less like a seat of power and more like a sturdy place to survive a siege of guests. People come here from all corners of the empire. Traders from Baghdad, princes from Kiev, spies from the Song dynasty, all sitting cross-legged, drinking maize milk, pretending not to notice the woman in the corner who just disassembled a deer with a spoon. There's no bureaucracy in the European sense. No towers full of scribes. There's just a man with a memory like a steel trap, and a few assistants who write things down using bone styluses and a tone of mild terror. Laws are spoken. Decrees are. Sent out on horseback. Paper is valuable. Ink is expensive. Mistakes are fatal, and yet the streets are clean, the roads are safe, the trade routes run like blood vessels. There's no poverty because there's no room for it. You're either useful or you're on a horse somewhere being made useful. This isn't Rome. This isn't Baghdad. This is the Mongol answer to urban civilization. Mobile, brutal, efficient, no spires, no statues, just felt, fire, and the knowledge that the entire city could vanish by sunrise and reappear 5 valleys away like it was never there at all. You steal a horse, you're hungry, you're cold. It looks unattended. You think just a quick ride, maybe 2 miles, maybe 3. You'll bring it back probably. They catch you before you hit the tree. Now you're on your knees in front of a man with a mustache so sharp it might count as a weapon. He's not angry. He's not shouting. He's just pointing at the horse, then at you, then at a nearby rock. Flat, broad, execution ready. You're about to learn something important. There are no jails, no appeals, no 16-step legal process. Justice in the Mongol Empire comes in two forms: repayment or removal. If you steal, you repay double if you can. If you can't, something else gets taken. A finger, a hand, occasionally your head, depending on the mood and the market value of what you tried to steal. You plead your case briefly. Mongols believe in clarity. If you talk too long, they assume you're lying. You shorten your explanation to 3 words and hope they count as a character reference. The elders discuss. One of them spits. Another one shrugs. Then they nod. Verdict. You live. Sentence. You walk. As in, you no longer ride. The horse is gone. You now follow the caravan on foot until your honor is considered untarnished, which may take a season or several. No one gives a timeline. Mongols aren't sentimental about rehabilitation. You're either punished or not. After that, they expect you to keep up. Murder, punishable by death, unless it was a justified blood feud, in which case you owe the family livestock, labor, or a wife. Preferably all 3, lying to your commander. Death, harming a fellow Mongol. Death harming a foreigner under protection. Double death with extra ceremony. On the other hand, honesty, courage, generosity, respected deeply. Even if you smell like fermented despair and ride like a sack of potatoes. If you speak truth and keep your word, you are considered worth feeding. Mongol law is harsh, but it's fast, predictable, and impossible to bribe. You know where you stand, usually in front of someone with a sword, and if your conscience is clean, so are your hands, mostly. The scouts return. No one speaks. They just nod toward the west, where smoke rises like a promise. It's a city, walled, fortified. The kind of place that believes its gates and guards mean something. That's adorable. You ride out at dawn. Behind you are engineers with carts full of surprises. Ropes, axes, fire pots, collapsible Ziege equipment. The Mongol version of party favors. There is no grand speech, no blessing, no drum roll. Just a few hand signals, and the subtle sound of 5, 0 men reaching for their bows. First, you circle. Always circle. You watch. You note weaknesses. A crooked tower, a badly placed gate, a section of wall that looks like it's seen better centuries. You whisper observations to your captain, who grunts and scratches something into the dirt with a dagger. Then the noise begins. Screams, horns, fire. You don't go straight in. You wait. Let panic do the work. Let the citizens trip over each other while deciding whether to hide the gold or bury the children. Every second they hesitate. Your engineers get closer with their ladders and their perfectly polite catapults. Walls not a problem. Mongols build siege towers on site, using materials from the landscape. Trees, rocks, occasional furniture from a recently evacuated monastery. You don't carry equipment, you carry confidence. The archers create a storm. It's not a volley, it's a weather system. Arrows blacken the sky and rain down with the soft th of progress. Then you ride in. You hit the gate, not like a hammer, like wind with teeth. You spill through the breach, blades drawn, horses foaming, eyes narrowed, not from rage, but calculation. This is not madness. This is math. Every alley you clear is one step closer to the granary. Every corner you conquer is logistics. You don't loot for greed. You loot for supply. And when it's done, when the towers fall and the banners are pulled down, you don't gloat. You inventory. Who surrendered? Who resisted? Who is useful? Who is decorative? The rest vanish swiftly, efficiently. And by nightfall, the city is Mongol. And you're already making plans to be somewhere else tomorrow. The banners are up, the bodies are down. The city is quiet now. The kind of quiet that comes after everyone realizes who's in charge. You, the conqueror. You, the horses-breathed outsider who was elbow-deep in a siege engine this morning and is now reviewing tax codes over goat stew. Because that's how it works. In the Mongol Empire, conquest isn't the end. It's the onboarding phase. The locals peek out from shattered windows and ruined temples, expecting the usual pillage, plunder, decades of burning resentment. Instead, they're greeted by a man in a fur coat, holding a list of professions. The Mongols don't destroy everything, only the things that resist, the rest cataloged. If you're a blacksmith, you stay. If you're a weaver, same. If you're a scholar, congratulations. You now work for a man who's never read a book, but understands exactly how many arrows it takes to erase a library. There's no formal government structure. There's you and a few scribes, and a mountain of Mongol common sense. You appoint officials, preferably locals, who understand the language and know how not to get stabbed during tax collection. Laws are simple. Obey the KHN. Pay what you owe. Don't cause trouble. If that sounds vague, don't worry. Enforcement is very clear. One warning, then rope. Trade routes are reopened by noon. Toll stations are manned by evening. And the market is already selling roasted fish like nothing happened, because commerce is the empire's second religion right after horses. You don't impose your culture. You don't build statues. You just make sure the grain gets counted and the caravans leave on time. Mongol rule is not about identity. It's about efficiency. You can keep your temples and your customs, just not your rebellion. A tax is levied. Census takers move in. And by week's end, the same people who were screaming yesterday are now grateful the roads are safer. You conquered them, yes, but you also improved delivery times. You're riding west now, further west than you've ever gone, past the familiar pastures, past the cities you helped sack, past even the yurts with familiar insults carved into them. This is the frontier. The ragged edge of the empire where the air is thin and the rumors are thick. No one gives you directions. Directions are for people with roads. What you get are gestures. A shrug toward a mountain, a vague wave past a smoking valley, and the eternal Mongol compass. Follow the bones. Out here, you ride past things the Empire hasn't yet decided whether to acknowledge. Strange stone towers, half-built forts abandoned mid-Amemor, trees with ribbons tied around them, gifts for gods who've clearly stopped answering mail. You pass a monastery with its doors ripped off. Inside there's incense and silence. A monk bows to you, offers you tea, and doesn't flinch when you track mud across his sacred floor. He's seen your kind before. He knows what happens when someone says no. Then come the rumors. Whispers about ghost armies, about cities that vanished overnight, about a mountain pass where a Khan's brother disappeared and came back 2 years later smiling and never blinking again. You don't believe most of it, but you ride slower anyway. At night, you camp in silence. No fires, no laughter, just you, your horse, and the sound of wolves having theological debates nearby. You wrap your cloak tighter and check your blade twice, not because of bandits, but because of stories that start with, "No one who rode this way, even your horse is uneasy. It whinnies at shadows." And this is a horse that's eaten human flesh and napped through thunder. The edge of the empire isn't marked by fences. It's marked by atmosphere, a thinning of command, a stretching of logic. Out here, the Khan's word arrives late, and often whispered. Still, your orders are clear. Scout, observe, return. You do all three in that order. You take note of every strange village, every half-finished temple, every field where the grass grows sideways. And when you turn back toward civilization, you feel the empire behind you. Heavy, brutal, real. The edge didn't swallow you this time. You've returned, not in glory exactly, but in one piece, which in Mongol terms is practically sainthood. Your horse is thinner. Your boots are blood-stained. Your teeth are fewer, but your scroll pouch is full. Names, maps, tribute tallies, the occasional sketch of a fortress that looked at you funny. You hand it over. The scribe nods. A commander grunts. The empire continues. And someday, far from here, in a quiet European library or a distracted Chinese court, someone will open a scroll and frown at your name. They will not pronounce it correctly. They will not understand the abbreviations. They will look at the numbers you counted with frozen fingers after 3 days without sleep and say, "These must be exaggerated." Because history has a funny habit. It smooths out the parts that make it nervous, and the Mongol Empire makes historians very nervous. They will call you barbarians, savages, a horde, as if you were all one blur of horses and arrows with no trade routes, no diplomats, no legal system, carved in blood and common sense. They'll forget the engineers, the postal system, the religious tolerance. They'll remember the sieges. Who wouldn't? But not the fact that you asked cities to surrender before flattening them, that you offered peace, order, and lower toll fees. They'll paint your face twisted in rage, never showing the months you spent negotiating over water rights with a man who bathed once per decade. They'll turn your pragmatic governance into chaos, your brutal discipline into madness, your efficient conquest into random destruction. And they'll conveniently ignore the part where their own kingdoms crumbled from within long before you showed up with a torch and a tactical plan. But you don't care because you weren't building a legacy. You were building roads, real ones. You were making empires answer for their walls. You were making the world smaller, one hoof beat at a time. And if the world remembers you only as a shadow from the east, that's fine. Charlemagne's exact birthplace is as mysterious as a monk's tax records. Some say he was born in Hurst. Others argue for Aachen or Ingelheim. The truth is, in the mid-8th century, nobody bothered with birth certificates, especially not for future emperors. What we do know is this. Around 742, a boy was born to Pepin the Short and Petrada of Lyon. And that boy would end up defining medieval Europe. Now Pepin was no ordinary Frankish noble. He had recently pulled off one of the slickest political coups of the age. He deposed the Merovingian puppet king Childeric III and secured papal blessing to crown himself king of the Franks. That means little Charlemagne was born not just into a powerful family, but into a dynasty that had just reinvented the concept of legitimate rule. Charlemagne's early childhood wasn't spent chasing frogs in a meadow. He was being prepped for war, rule, and theology, sometimes all at once. Frankish education wasn't exactly poetry and philosophy. It was heavy on swords, prayer, and how to keep unruly nobles from stabbing you in your sleep. His tutor, possibly a man named Fulrad, who was less story time at bedtime and more recite these Latin prayers or feel my wrath. We don't know much about young Charlemagne's personality. He didn't leave a diary, and his biographer, Einhard, wrote about him the way a fanboy writes about a celebrity crush. But one thing is clear. Even in his youth, Charlemagne stood out. Not just because he was over 6 feet tall in an age when 5 feet was impressive, but because he took to leadership like a duck to water, or more accurately, like a Frank to conquest. By the time his father died in 768, Charlemagne was more than ready to inherit the kingdom. Well, half of it. In true medieval fashion, the realm was split between him and his brother, Carlin. Sharing power never works well in monarchies or at family dinners. So naturally, tension started simmering. But for now, Charlemagne was officially king, young, ambitious, and already eyeing a Europe that hadn't been united since Rome. The crown was on his head, the sword was in his hand, and Europe. Europe was about to meet its new architect. Charlemagne's first challenge, as king, wasn't a foreign invasion or rebellious noble. It was Carlin, his younger brother, the other guy with a crown. Pepin the Short, in all his wisdom, had split the Frankish kingdom in half, giving Charlemagne the western part and Carlin the eastern. In theory, this was supposed to be a peaceful joint venture. In practice, it was a passive-aggressive disaster with swords. The brothers didn't get along at all. Their territories were technically allied, but their courts operated like rival war camps. Charlemagne was suspicious, prideful, and possibly just plain difficult. Charlemagne, on the other hand, was already showing signs of being a ruthless strategist, and wasn't about to let baby brother clip his wings. Tensions escalated over petty slights and political maneuvering. One particularly telling moment came when Charlemagne was called to help suppress a rebellion in Aquitaine. Instead of joining forces, Charlemagne refused to send troops. Classic little brother move. Sit back. Let big bro do all the fighting, then sulk when he gets the credit. Now, into this delicate mess walked Decidius, the king of the Lombards in northern Italy. He offered Charlemagne a marriage alliance, his daughter, in exchange for peace and cooperation. Charlemagne, ever the opportunist, said sure, and married her. Charlemagne? He saw this as a betrayal. Decidius had once supported their father, and now Charlemagne was cozying up to him. The situation was a medieval soap opera, and just when things were about to boil over, Carlin died conveniently. In 771, barely 3 years into their dual reign, Carlin suddenly kicked the royal bucket at the age of 20. Cause of death? Natural, according to official sources, which in medieval terms could mean anything from pneumonia to he looked at someone the wrong way. Charlemagne wasted no time. He moved into his brother's territory like a man who'd been planning it since day one. Carlin's widow and children fled to guess who? Decidius, who was now fuming. So Charlemagne now had all of Francia under his rule. No more brother, no more coaking, just one man, one crown, and a growing list of enemies. And next on that list, the in-laws. Now that Carloman was out of the picture, Charlemagne had a kingdom to himself and a problem in Italy, specifically Decidius, king of the Lombards. You know, the guy whose daughter Charlemagne had married and then very quietly divorced the moment Carlin died. Awkward. Desiderius was not pleased. To make matters worse, he had taken in Carlin's widow and sons, and was now openly supporting their claim to Charlemagne's throne. That's not just annoying in medieval politics. That's basically a declaration of war with a bow on it. Charlemagne didn't hesitate. In 773, he marched his army across the Alps. And no, this wasn't some summer stroll through the mountains. Crossing the Alps meant snow, narrow passes, and the occasional unexpected avalanche. But Charlemagne did it anyway, because Charlemagne didn't let mountains, family drama, or bad weather stop him from getting what he wanted. Once he reached Italy, Charlemagne laid siege to Pavia, the Lombard capital. Decidius dug in for the long haul. Unfortunately for him, Charlemagne had the patience of a monk copying scripture. He surrounded the city and waited. Months passed. Supplies dwindled. Morale plummeted. By 774, Pavia surrendered. And Charlemagne didn't just win a war, he took the Lombard crown for himself. That's right. He didn't install a puppet ruler or play nice with local nobility. He simply declared himself king of the Lombards. That made him ruler of both the Franks and the Lombards. A medieval power move so bold, it echoed all the way to Rome. Speaking of Rome, the Pope Adrian, I had been nervously watching all of this from the Vatican like a bishop holding his breath during a chess match. Desiderius had threatened the Papal States before, and the Pope had hoped Charlemagne would come to the rescue. Charlemagne did, and in return, he received the Pope's blessing, and a convenient alliance with the Church that would last for decades. The Lombard campaign wasn't just a family feud turned conquest. It was a statement. Charlemagne wasn't playing by the old tribal rules anymore. He was building an empire. And now he had the backing of God's representative on earth, which made it a lot harder for anyone to say no to him. With Italy under control, and the Pope sending warm regards, Charlemagne turned his gaze north toward the Saxons. These weren't courtly nobles sipping wine. These were pagan tribes, wild, warlike, and deeply allergic to Christianity, and they had been poking at the Frankish borders for years, raiding villages, and disrespecting everything holy. Charlemagne had had enough. Starting in 772, he launched a campaign that would become his most infamous, the Saxon Wars. Not a single war, mind you, but 18 separate campaigns spread over 30 years. Because the Saxons, bless their forest-dwelling hearts, refused to roll over. At first it went well. Charlemagne stormed into Saxony, burned down the sacred Manil, basically their holy tree, and declared, "Time to be Christian, folks." The Saxons responded the way any proud warrior people would. They smiled politely, said, "Sure, no problem," and then immediately rebelled the moment his army left. This happened repeatedly. Charlemagne would march in, crush resistance, baptize a few thousand terrified locals at sword point, and leave. Then the Saxons would torture church, kill the priests, and go back to worshipping their old gods. The most notorious moment came in 782 after a major rebellion. Charlemagne ordered the massacre of Verdun, executing around 500 Saxons in a single day. It was brutal, even by medieval standards, and it sent a message. Conversion wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Now, Charlemagne didn't just want obedience, he wanted spiritual obedience. He genuinely believed it was his Christian duty to save souls, even if those souls were being saved through fire and steel. Monks followed his armies. Churches were built as quickly as fortresses, and any Saxon who refused baptism, well, let's just say the baptismal font came with backup swords. But for all his efforts, the Saxons just wouldn't stay conquered. The forests of northern Germany became a graveyard for Frankish soldiers and a test of Charlemagne's patience. Year after year, revolt after revolt, the war dragged on. Charlemagne wasn't just a sword-swinging conqueror. He also had a soft spot for books. Yes, this man who spent decades stomping Saxons into reluctant baptism also launched one of Europe's most important educational revival. Welcome to the Carolian Renaissance, a movement less about oil painting and more about making sure monks knew how to spell. You see, Charlemagne had a problem. His empire was growing faster than anyone could govern it. And the priests, nobles, and officials he relied on were, how shall we put this, functionally illiterate. The administration was becoming a game of medieval telephone, and even the Bible was getting creatively interpreted. So, Charlemagne did something radical. He declared that education mattered. He invited the best scholars in Europe to his court. Chief among them was Alcuin of York, a non-nonsense Anglo-Saxon intellectual who probably viewed bad Latin the way modern editors view Comic Sans. Under Alcuin's guidance, Charlemagne founded palace schools, set curriculum standards, and insisted that monasteries double as classrooms. And this wasn't just for nobles. Charlemagne wanted everyone, priests, scribes, and even peasants, to have at least a shot at learning how to read and write. In Latin, of course. Because what's the point of being educated if you can't read the Vulgate? Ironically, despite pushing education so hard, Charlemagne himself was barely literate. He could speak several languages, but reading, writing, hey, he tried to learn. There are stories of him keeping wax tablets under his pillow to practice writing at night. But ruling an empire didn't exactly leave much time for penmanship. Still, Charlemagne led by example. He valued knowledge. He respected scholars. He even standardized handwriting. Yes, Carolean minuscule, that clean, readable script that modern fonts still copy, was his doing. Before that, manuscripts looked like someone spilled ink while having a seizure. Thanks to his efforts, thousands of ancient texts were preserved. Monks began copying manuscripts like their lives depended on it because sometimes they did. Literacy rates improved. The church became more coherent, and Europe took one cautious step out of the dark ages. It was Christmas Day, 800 AD. The streets of Rome were cold, the churches packed, and Charlemagne was attending Mass in St. Peter's Basilica like a good Christian king. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Until Pope Leo III pulled off one of the most theatrical surprise moves in medieval history. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, the Pope suddenly placed a golden crown on his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. Just like that. No warning, no formal ceremony, no polite, "Hey, Charles, do you maybe want to be emperor?" Nope, just boom, instant empire. Historians still argue over whether Charlemagne knew this was going to happen. Some say it was staged. Others say it caught him off guard. Charlemagne himself later claimed he would never have entered the church had he known, which is a very emperor thing to say. Either way, the symbolism was enormous. The Roman Empire had fallen back in 476. Now, over 3 centuries later, the Pope was effectively resurrecting it with Charlemagne as its new head. A Frankish king crowned by the church, ruling over a patchwork of Germanic tribes, Lombards, and Latin-speaking clergy. The Holy Roman Empire was born. Although that name wouldn't be used for a while, this moment shifted everything. Charlemagne's authority was no longer just military. It was spiritual, divine. He was now seen as the successor to the Caesars, a Christian Caesar with the Pope as both ally and spiritual referee. But not everyone was thrilled. The Byzantine over in Constantinople had been calling themselves Roman emperors for centuries and did not appreciate some Frankish upstart playing emperor in the West. For decades, Diplomatic relations were tense, with titles flung around like insults and treaties scribbled under duress. Back home, though, the title stuck. Charlemagne reigned as emperor until his death in 814, and the imperial dignity gave weight to everything he did, from issuing laws to reforming the church. It was the capstone of his rule, a crown not just made of gold, but of legitimacy, myth, and historical theater. Conquering half of Europe is impressive. Keeping it running without the whole thing collapsing into civil war. That's the real magic trick. And Charlemagne, oddly enough, managed it not just through blood and steel, but with ink, messengers, monks, and the medieval version of spreadsheets. Once he was emperor, Charlemagne got serious about governance. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once, so he started building a system that looked suspiciously like an early version of modern bureaucracy, just with more Latin and slightly fewer bribes. Probably at the heart of his administration were the Missi Dominici, literally the Lord's envoys. These were trusted officials, always sent in pairs, usually one noble and one bishop, who traveled around the empire, delivering royal orders, inspecting local lords, and making sure no one was quietly building their own little kingdom in the backwoods. Think of them as medieval auditors, only with swords and divine backing. Local counts and dukes still ruled their regions, but they answered to Charlemagne. And if they didn't, well, a friendly visit from a Mrs. Dominicus could quickly turn into a career-ending conversation. Charlemagne didn't do tolerance when it came to disloyalty. He also introduced capitularies, written laws and instructions that applied across the empire. These covered everything from how to run a monastery to how many soldiers a noble had to provide to what kind of bread should be served at imperial banquets. Yes, even bread regulation, because you can't have an empire falling apart over badly baked loaves. But this wasn't just micromanagement for its own sake. Charlemagne believed in order, Christian order, and to him, a stable, well-run empire reflected divine favor. His laws weren't just legal, they were moral. He wanted a society where everyone knew their role, paid their taxes to the church and to him, and prayed at the proper time, preferably under a roof he had personally authorized. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still existed. Communication was slow, and sometimes local lords quietly ignored orders when no one was watching. But for a man ruling over a territory that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, it worked surprisingly well. By the early 800s, Charlemagne's empire was the biggest Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. From modern-day France and Germany to northern Italy and parts of Central Europe, his domain stretched across cultures, languages, and weather patterns that could give a bishop frostbite in July. The man ruled over Catholics, pagans, semi-Christianized tribes, ambitious nobles, and moody bishops. And somehow he kept them all more or less in line. On the surface, things looked glorious. The Carolingian Renaissance was in full swing. Monasteries were copying books like caffeinated scribes. Law and order had a vaguely uniform shape. Even coins bore Charlemagne's image, glaring sternly in profile because nothing says, "I'm in," charge like putting your face in every pocket. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming. For starters, succession. Charlemagne had many children, at least 18, thanks to a rotating cast of wives and concubines, but only a few were considered politically viable. He had once divided the empire among 3 sons, just like his father had. Then one died, then another. By 806, he was down to one heir, Louis the Pious, the youngest and, well, the most monk-like. Louis was a good Christian, quiet, thoughtful, kind. In other words, the polar opposite of Charlemagne. When your empire depends on intimidation and iron will, handing it off to someone who prefers psalms over politics feels risky. Then, there was the nobility. During Charlemagne's reign, they were kept in check by sheer fear and efficiency. But even then, local counts were getting bolder. Some enforced royal laws with gusto. Others treated them like polite suggestions. The empire was stable, but it was a personality cult held together by one man's presence and very few backup systems. Add to that the endless wars, constant rebellions, especially from the still not fully subdued Saxons, and the cost of maintaining armies, and the pressure was building. Even the church, while mostly loyal, had its own ambitions. Bishops had political power, abbots controlled vast lands, and while they blessed Charlemagne's rule with one hand, they sometimes pushed back with the other, especially when royal demands clashed with canon law or monastery budgets. The empire was brilliant, but like all things built at speed and scale, it depended on the one person who could command it all, and that person was getting old. In the winter of 814, Charlemagne fell ill. He was in Erikson, his favored palace city, surrounded by scholars, advisors, and the lingering smell of burned firewood and ink-stained parchment. He was 72, a near miraculous age for a man who'd spent decades fighting wars, crossing mountains, and making sure every noble knew who was boss. Despite his warrior image, his decline was slow and almost quiet. He fasted, prayed, and, as Einhard, his devoted biographer, put it, accepted death with a calm dignity befitting a Christian emperor. On January 28th, 814, Charlemagne died. The bells rang. The empire held its breath. They buried him in Erikson Cathedral beneath a marble throne, wrapped in imperial robes, sword at his side, and a copy of the Gospels in his lap. Not a bad send-off for a man who had once been crowned Emperor of the Romans in a surprise ceremony. Later, legends would claim he sat upright in his tomb, like a sleeping king, ready to rise again if the empire ever needed him. Romantic nonsense, of course, but telling his only surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the whole empire along with its unwieldy borders, rebellious nobles, and growing unrest. Louis tried to rule well, he really did. But he wasn't his father. The iron grip loosened, power fragmented, civil wars broke out. Within a few decades, the grand empire Charlemagne built was split into pieces, eventually giving rise to France and Germany as separate kingdoms. And yet, Charlemagne's legacy didn't dissolve with his empire. It grew. He became a mythic figure, Carolus Magnus, the ideal Christian king. Popes invoked his memory. Emperors styled themselves in his image. The Holy Roman Empire, founded long after his death, claimed him as its spiritual father. Even Napoleon, centuries later, modeled his coronation after Charlemagne's, eager to snatch a bit of that old divine glow. Charlemagne didn't just unify Europe. He gave it a blueprint, a fusion of Roman law, Germanic kingship, and Christian faith. He helped drag a continent out of the ruins of the Dark Ages and planted the seeds for the nations that would define it. When he died, the world lost a man, but it gained a legend. And legends, as Europe would prove again and again, are far harder to bury. A medieval feast was not just about eating, it was about being seen. Picture this. Long wooden tables draped in cloth, flickering torches casting shadows on stone walls, and the scent of roasted boar mingling with wine, sweat, and ambition. This wasn't dinner, this was theater. And every dish, every seat, every spoonful served was part of a carefully choreographed social ritual. In a world where birth determined rank, feasts gave the ruling class a chance to remind everyone of their place. Seating arrangements were political chess moves. The lord and lady sat at the high table, literally elevated, both in furniture and in status. The closer you were seated to them, the more important you were. If you found yourself staring at a drafty wall next to the musicians, you weren't just cold, you were expendable. Food arrived in waves called removes, like acts in a play. The first course might feature stuffed peacocks with their feathers reattached just for flair. Then came platters of venison, swans, pigeons in pie crusts, and roasted boar's heads with apples in their mouths. Nothing subtle. If the animal once had a face, it was likely staring back at you now, glazed in wine sauce. And then there were the subtleties. Elaborate, edible sculptures made of sugar, marzipan, or pastry shaped into castles, saints, mythical creatures, or scenes from biblical epics. These weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to be admired or gawked at, preferably both. But it wasn't just about flexing wealth. Feasts were political tools. Treaties were negotiated between bites of pheasant. Alliances were solidified over goblets of spiced wine. Marriages were arranged between courses. Hosting a bad feast could ruin a reputation. Hosting a great one that could buy loyalty for years. Even silence had meaning. Guests weren't just allowed to speak freely. Toasts were timed. Music cued conversations. A juggler might perform to distract from an awkward lull. A poet might recite flattery so syrupy it made the boar seem bland. Behind every grand medieval feast was a scene of pure, beautiful chaos. The castle kitchen. Not your cozy modern space with ceramic countertops and herb gardens. No, this was a smoky, shouting, wood-fired war zone run by a hierarchy that would make a small army blush. At the top of this culinary command tower stood the master cook, the Gordon Ramsay of his day, minus the swearing, or with more swearing in Latin. He oversaw dozens of assistants, spit turners, pot boys, pastry makers, fish cleaners, sourcemen, and at least one poor soul whose job was just plucking poultry all day. And they weren't whipping up 2 or 3 dishes. They were making hundreds, often without a single written recipe, because cookbooks were rare, handwritten, and kept under tighter lock than some treasure chests. The kitchen fire roared day and night. There were no thermostats, just blistered hands, guesswork, and prayer. Meat was roasted on massive spits, turned manually, usually by young boys whose arms never stopped spinning, and the size of the meat. Let's just say a cow might show up in pieces over the course of a 3-day feast. Sauces were vital. Everything was doused in a combination of vinegar, wine, and exotic spices. Not because they were trying to mask rotten food, as the myth says. That would have insulted the guests, but because spices were wealth, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these were imported luxuries. Serving them wasn't just about flavor, it was about flexing trade connections. This chicken tastes like cinnamon was basically medieval for I'm loaded. Bread was a staple but came in different classes. The nobility got the fine white man bread. The servants ate the coarser brown loaves, and under every dish was a trench, a stale piece of bread used as a plate, which soaked up all the greasy juices, and was then either eaten by the lower classes, or thrown to the dogs, or both, depending on the dog's manners. The smell, a blend of herbs, meat, yeast, sweat, and fire. The noise, constant clanging, shouting, and the occasional panicked squawk from a goose that had not yet accepted its fate. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient, and without it, the entire illusion of effortless nobility upstairs would have collapsed like a poorly baked pie. If you ever got invited to a medieval feast, congratulations. You were either important, rich, or someone's political porn. But what actually landed on your plate? Let's just say if you're a picky eater, you might want to look away. Meat ruled the table. Deer, wild boar, rabbit, pheasant, swan, even porpoise. If you were dining on a particularly eccentric coastline, everything that could walk, fly, swim, or vaguely resemble meat was fair game. Literally, hunting was both sport and supply chain. Nobles went out and killed the food they would later brag about while eating it. And the rarer the animal, the higher the status. Whole roasted animals were the stars of the show. Picture an entire pig, snout polished, teeth bared, apple in mouth, or a swan, feathers reapplied post-cooking because presentation. If it looked dangerous before, it was supposed to look majestic now. But it wasn't just about quantity. The menu was strategic. You didn't dump everything on the table at once. You served it in courses called removes. The first might include light affair, soups, small pies, fish if it was Friday, and the church was watching. Later courses escalated to the heavy hitters, roasts, game, pies stuffed with meat and spice, and more meat. Fish had its own day in the spotlight, especially during fasting seasons. Eels, pike, and herring were frequent guests. Sometimes molded into the shapes of animals they were definitely not. Because why serve boring boiled fish when you can serve a fish that looks like a hedgehog? And the spices? Oh, the spices. Medieval people didn't believe in bland. Cinnamon on chicken? Absolutely. Ginger and gravy, of course. Sugar on meat? Why not? Sweet and savory lived happily on the same plate, sometimes on the same bite. Vegetables, by contrast, were suspiciously absent from noble plates. Root vegetables and greens were often seen as peasant food, too humble, too earthy. Lords didn't care for turnips unless they were stuffed into a pastry shaped like a unicorn. By the end of the feast, the menu had gone from tame to theatrical. The goal wasn't to satisfy hunger. The goal was to overwhelm, to dazzle, to leave your guests stuffed, stunned, and maybe just slightly afraid of the next remove. Because dessert might just be breathing fire. While the food did its job of clogging arteries and signaling wealth, a medieval feast wasn't complete without entertainment, and lots of it. You didn't just eat. You laughed, listened, gawked, and occasionally winced at whatever unfolded between courses. Enter the fool, the court jester clad in bells, mismatched colors, and enough audacity to insult the host without getting beheaded. Usually, the fool's job was to make people laugh, mock the powerful, and provide an air of controlled chaos. They juggled, told stories, and performed slapstick routines with the finesse of someone who knew that one bad joke could end in unemployment or execution. Then came the minstrels with their lutes, harps, and voices trained in ballads about love, war, and the occasional dragon. Music filled the free hall, not as background ambiance, but as part of the experience. These songs weren't just for mood. They were political commentary, historical records, and flattery disguised as melody. If the lord of the house was featured heroically in the third verse, congratulations, the minstrel would eat well tonight. For something flashier, you had acrobats and fire breathers. Yes, real fire. Indoors in a wooden hall lined with rushes and tapestries. Safety codes were a distant fantasy. Sword swallowers, animal tamers, even dancing. Bears made appearances, though the bears weren't always thrilled about it. And then there were the subtleties, edible performances, sugar sculptures that doubled as political satire, giant pies with live birds inside, released mid-course for dramatic flair. Nothing said we're rich, like cutting into a pie and watching doves explode from it, while the guests politely applauded and tried not to get pooped on. Some feasts included morality plays, little theatrical skits about virtue, sin, or the dangers of not respecting the church. These were performed by traveling troops or occasionally by monks who were far too excited to play the devil. Everything was calculated. Entertainment kept the mood light, distracted from political tension, and ensured that no guest had time to whisper rebellion between sips of me. A good entertainer could prevent a duel. A bad one might start one. At a medieval feast, you weren't just watching a show. You were the show. And the laughter. That was just another way to keep the knives pointed away from the host. In the medieval world, what you ate wasn't nearly as important as who you ate it with. A feast was the medieval version of a press conference. Marriage proposal, court negotiation, and corporate takeover rolled into one gloriously greasy event. Hosting a feast wasn't just hospitality. It was strategy. It signaled wealth, power, generosity, and control. And every single element from seating arrangement to source choice communicated status. Take seating, for example. The high table wasn't just physically elevated. It was socially radioactive. The lord and lady sat in the center, flanked by their most honored guests, bishops, foreign ambassadors, visiting nobles. If you were anywhere near the salt cellar, you were somebody. Everyone else was, well, just happy to be breathing the same roasted air. That's where we get the term above the salt. You are either close to the host and important, or seated near the floor with the minstrels and empty wine jugs. Invitations weren't handed out like candy. Being summoned to a feast meant you mattered, and refusing to attend. That was a statement, one that might earn you a visit from armed men asking why your chair was empty. On the flip side, attending the feast of arrival could mean you were switching sides. Every guest list was a political minefield. The food itself carried messages. Serving a particular regional delicacy could flatter a visiting duke. Offering an overabundance of game meant, look how vast and well-stocked my lands are, including foreign spices, said, I have trade connections you only dream about. Even wine could be loaded with meaning. Was it local, imported, blessed by a bishop? Then there were the gifts. Guests sometimes brought offerings, jewels, relics, horses, and were expected to praise the host in return. Toasts were part flattery, part performance, and sometimes part warning. Feasts were also the stage for alliances. A marriage match could be sealed over honeyed quail, a land dispute resolved by the third remove. And if all else failed, a rival lord could be made drunk enough to sign something stupid or too poisoned to wake up the next morning. For all its gluttony and grandeur, medieval feasting was heavily shaped by the one authority even kings didn't mess with, the church. And the church had opinions, strong ones, about what you could eat, when you could eat it, and just how guilty you should feel afterward. In the medieval calendar, there were more fasting days than feasting days. That's not an exaggeration. Nearly half the year was designated for some form of dietary restriction. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, various vigils, you name it. And on these days, meat from land animals was strictly off the table, literally. So, how did the nobility cope? With creativity, they still threw feasts. They just swapped out ingredients. Out went beef, pork, and venison. In came fish, eggs, almonds, and anything that could pretend it wasn't technically meat. Beaver tails, for example, were considered fish because they were scaly and aquatic. Problem solved. God's fine with loopholes, right? Dishes became culinary acrobatics. Chefs molded almond milk into imitation cheese. They turned fish into fake roasts. Some meals looked like sin, but technically followed the rules. And of course, wine didn't count as food. It never does. On feast days celebrating saints or holy events. However, it was open season, and the church threw its own festivals too. Easter, Christmas, Epiphany. These weren't just sacred. They were licensed excuses to eat everything in sight. Christmas feast might stretch for 12 full days, each course bigger and more absurd than the last, because nothing says Christ is born like a pie with 4 types of bird inside. Monasteries weren't exempt either. Though monks were supposed to live humbly, some abbeys became legendary for their kitchens. A wealthy monastery might fast on oysters and spiced eel. Monks developed precise food schedules, including seasonal menus and loophole-heavy substitutions that kept their bellies full and their sins technical. Still, food was spiritual business. Feasting wasn't just indulgence. It was a divine performance. You gave thanks before you ate, made offerings to the church after, and prayed your cook hadn't served you meat on the wrong Thursday. In the medieval world, gluttony was a sin, but banqueting with holiness, that was practically a sacrament. For all the roasting boars and juggling fools, a medieval feast was not a free-for-all. There were rules, many of them. In fact, if you wanted to keep your status and your seat, you had to know how to behave like a proper greasy-fingered noble. First rule, don't touch the food like a peasant. Forks weren't widely used yet, so people mostly ate with their fingers, but there was a system to it. You used the first 3 fingers of your right hand, never your left, unless you wanted to start rumors about witchcraft or poor hygiene. Second, don't lick your fingers until the end of the meal. It was considered perfectly acceptable to rinse your hands in a shared basin between courses, but licking them during dinner, that was low class, like showing up without shoes, or being French in an English castle. Every guest had their own knife, which they brought with them. Your host didn't provide cutlery, just food and a place to put it. Your knife wasn't just for cutting. It was a personal statement like a medieval iPhone. Flashy handle. You're important. Rusty blade. Enjoy sitting by the firewood. Drinking etiquette was its own battlefield. You didn't just guzzle your wine. You toasted. You sipped. You offered the cup to your neighbor, especially if you were angling for a favor or wanted to politely challenge them to a duel later. And yes, you shared goblets. Germ theory hadn't been invented yet, and everyone was too busy dying from plague to worry about lip contact. Then there was conversation. You were expected to talk, but not too much. Laugh, but not too loudly. Praise the food, but not more than the host. Don't speak with your mouth full unless you're insulting a rival, and don't burp unless you're Mongolian, or drunk, or both. At fancier feasts, hand-washing rituals were practically ceremonial. Servants poured scented water over guests' hands, often before the first remove, and again before dessert, not for cleanliness, just to remind everyone how refined they were. Etiquette wasn't about being polite. It was about proving you belonged. One slip, spilled wine, a dirty sleeve, reaching too far across the table, and suddenly you weren't feasting with lords. You were back with the dogs, and they didn't share the wine. After the last swan was carved, the final toast delivered, and the fool escorted out for juggling bread rolls into a bishop's goblet, one question remained. What happened to the food? Medieval feasts produced an obscene amount of it. Boars, pies, jellied fish, sugar castles, and bread trenches soaked in meat drippings. It was more than even the hungriest noble could consume. But waste was a luxury too. What you didn't eat sent just as loud a message as what you served. So, where did it all go? If you were lucky, it went to the servants. They ate in shifts after the feast, picking over what remained from the lower tables. Sometimes they'd get choice cuts, especially if a favored guest passed along their untouched roast or decided not to eat the stuffed hedgehog pastry. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat porridge. The trencher bread, that thick slice acting as a plate, was a special case. Saturated with sauces and grease, it was rarely eaten by the nobles unless they were really drunk. Instead, these soggy slabs were collected and often distributed to the poor. Not out of charity, mind you. It was more like nobles saying, "Here, have the leftovers of our greatness." But if you were a peasant, getting a slab soaked in spiced boar fat was better than a sermon on humility. In monasteries and churches, feast leftovers became arms. Feeding the poor wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Leftovers were gathered into baskets, blessed, probably after the fingers were picked out, and handed out as a moral duty. Sometimes the poor were even invited to dine in the great hall after the nobles left, though seated in a very different spot, and usually without the juggling bear. Still, not everything went to hungry mouths. Some of it was simply thrown out, fed to pigs, or composted in castle-mitten heaps. Why? Because in medieval high society, restraint was overrated. A surplus showed wealth. Letting food spoil quietly behind the kitchen door was just part of the show. So while the nobles sobered up and congratulated themselves on a feast well hosted, life went on for the rest. Servants nibbling bones, peasants lining up for trenches, dogs wrestling over fish heads. Because in the medieval world, even leftovers had a hierarchy. The candles had burned low, the minstrels were snoring under benches, half the guests were face down in pie crusts, and the other half were staggering through castle corridors looking for their shoes or dignity. The feast was over, but the morning after, that was a whole different ritual. Cleanup began before the guests even left. Servants moved like ghosts, clearing bones, scraping trenches, and sweeping rushes off the floor. Those sweet-smelling herbs scattered to mask the stink of sweat, spilled wine, and noble flatulence. Rushes had to be replaced regularly, especially after a feast where the floor absorbed more than just crumbs. And then came the reckoning. The steward, essentially the medieval party planner, assessed the damage. Broken goblets, missing silverware, a suspicious amount of spilled gravy near the bishop's seat. It all went into the report. Sometimes guests even stole cutlery as a weird badge of honor. If you left with a spoon, it meant you were important enough to dare. The kitchen was a battlefield. Burned pots, cracked platters, and enough grease to oil a drawbridge. Cooks staggered out like survivors, some missing eyebrows from the oven fire, others grumbling about, "Next time we just serve porridge." For the host, though, the real work had just begun. The politics of gratitude kicked in. Letters were written, gifts sent, compliments paid, if a powerful guest wasn't properly thanked, or worse, if they were seated too far from the roast swan, grudges could form. And medieval grudges had a way of turning into feuds or wars. Sometimes a feast backfired, a guest insulted, an alliance offended, a drunken noble confessing to treason over mulled wine. One ill-timed toast could undo months of diplomacy. The feast was a show, yes, but like all theater, the reviews could kill you. For the lower classes, the morning after was business as usual. Some washed dishes, some shoveled refuse, some got lucky and found a forgotten crust of almond cake behind the dais. That was breakfast. And then quietly, the castle returned to its rhythm. The banners came down, the dogs were fed, the torches extinguished until the next celebration, coronation or wedding, or excuse to impress the neighbors. Feasting season was closed, but its echoes lingered like smoke in the rafters and wine stains on the stone, because in the medieval world, no one ever forgot a good feast or a bad one. Erikson didn't enter the world quietly. Around the year 970, possibly in Iceland, maybe in Greenland, depending on which saga you're trying to decode, he was born into a family of exile, ambition, and very poor impulse control. His father was Erik the Red, a hot-headed Norwegian outlaw exiled for murder, who then got exiled again from Iceland for, shockingly, more murder. Instead of learning restraint, Erik discovered Greenland. Because if you're going to be banned from one frozen island, why not claim another? Leif grew up in this rugged frontier settlement where winters were cruel, neighbors were scarce, and the only consistent export was stories. Greenland wasn't a thriving colony. It was barely a functioning outpost held together by stubbornness, driftwood, and fish. But it gave Leif something that mattered more than comfort, perspective. He knew what it meant to survive on the edge of the known world. His family was steeped in Norse tradition, hard-drinking, hard-fighting, and perpetually skeptical of outside authority. Yet even amid this rugged culture, Leif was different. He was curious, reflective, observant. According to the sagas, he was tall, strong, handsome, naturally and notably more thoughtful than his volatile father. He wasn't raised on scrolls or scholars. He was raised on sagas, oral tales of gods, monsters, voyages, and revenge. These stories weren't bedtime. They were survival manuals, wrapped in mythology, and they seeped into Leif like seabine into a long ship's hull. Greenland's isolation left young Leif hungry for something more. Unlike his father, whose ambition ended in exile and bloodshed, Leif looked outward toward Iceland, toward Norway, toward the horizon. He listened to old sailors speak of strange lands beyond the ice. He studied the stars, and he watched the tides. By the time he reached manhood, he wasn't just the son of Erik the Red. He was a Norseman with a boat, a brain, and a burning need to explore something. Anything that wasn't a freezing rock filled with equally frozen egos. Before he ever sailed west, before the church came calling, before his name landed in sagas and schoolbooks, Leif Erikson was a boy born of fire and ice, destined to outrun both. Leif didn't just drift into greatness, he sailed into it. At some point in his early adulthood, Leif left Greenland behind and traveled to Norway, the old heart of Norse power. It was more than a homecoming. It was a collision with a world far more advanced, hierarchical, and surprisingly holy. Because Norway wasn't the same place his father had fled. It was now ruled by King Olaf Tryggsson, a man with a crown, a sword, and a serious fixation on converting the Norse to Christianity, whether they liked it or not. Leif found himself face to face with Olaf, a Christian warrior king who had replaced blood feuds with baptisms and long ships with churches. And unlike many of his countrymen, Leif didn't scoff. He listened. Perhaps it was diplomacy, perhaps curiosity, or maybe Leif had grown tired of the endless cycle of raids, revenge, and gods who mostly demanded blood and beer. Whatever the reason, Leif was baptized, accepted Christianity, and was given a new mission: bring the faith back to Greenland. It wasn't exactly an easy assignment. Imagine trying to explain monotheism to a bunch of farmers who regularly sacrificed goats to Thor when the weather got weird. Greenland was remote, suspicious of outsiders, and still mostly loyal to Odin, Freya, and the rest of the thunder-happy crew. But Leif didn't return empty-handed. He brought priests, knowledge, and royal support. When he landed in Greenland again, he wasn't just a chieftain's son. He was an emissary of a king and a new god. And while he didn't exactly spark a revival overnight, his influence began to take root. Christianity started spreading in small, icy circles. Chapels were built. Crosses were raised. Old gods weren't replaced immediately, but they had serious competition. This marked a turning point. Leif wasn't just a sailor or a settler anymore. He was a cultural bridge, a man between two worlds: Norse tradition and Christian order, pagan legend and written law. He had one foot in Valhalla and the other in Bethlehem, and somewhere between converting his neighbors and maintaining fragile peace, Leif Erikson began hearing tales of strange lands to the west, lands with grapes, forests, and no snow in sight. The next great voyage was calling. Some great discoveries begin with ambition, others begin with bad navigation. Leif Erikson had set sail from Norway with noble intentions: bring Christianity to Greenland, and maybe check in on the family drama while he was at it. But fate, or perhaps the North Atlantic's notoriously moody weather, had other plans. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, Leif heard whispers of a strange land far west, seen years earlier by a man named Bjarni Haraldson, who had glimpsed unknown shores but never bothered to land. Classic Bjarni, a man who discovered North America and then just kept sailing like he had groceries in the back. Leif, however, was made of different wood. Around the year 1000, he bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew, and decided to find out what lay beyond the horizon. He wasn't just sailing into the unknown. He was sailing into legend. The journey was perilous. Icebergs, storms, and the real possibility of falling off the edge of the earth kept things interesting. But Leif was calm, steady, and as the sagas claim, annoyingly competent. Eventually, his ship reached a place very unlike Greenland. First came a barren land he named Heeland, likely modern-day Baffin Island, flat, rocky, and unimpressed. Then Markland, probably Labrador, with forests thick enough to build an entire fleet. Useful, but still not quite the promised land. Finally, Leif arrived at a place so mild, so rich in resources, that his crew named it Finland, the land of wine, or grapes, or possibly fermented berries. The sagas are vague, and Norsemen weren't exactly sommeliers. Regardless, the place was a paradise compared to the icy death trap they called home. They built houses, explored rivers, and enjoyed the novelty of not having to chip their drinking water out of a glacier. Leif called the main settlement Leif's Buddha, Leif's Booths. Humble name for a man accidentally making history. He stayed through the winter, mapping the land, gathering timber, and preparing stories that would shake the north once he returned. There were no grand conquests, no wars, just quiet, practical exploration. Surprisingly modern for a Viking. Leif didn't plant flags or declare ownership. He just observed, named, and left. And yet, in doing so, he became the first European to set foot in North America. Before Columbus, before maps, before anyone knew what he'd done, Leif Erikson's landing in Vinland should have been the start of a new Norse golden age. Mild climate, wild grapes, tall timber, no frostbite. What more could a Greenlander ask for? But paradise, as it turns out, comes with problems, especially when you don't ask the locals if they mind visitors. According to the sagas, Leif and his crew spent a winter in Vinland, building huts and gathering valuable resources. They found self-growing wheat, vast forests, and enough fish to feed a saga's worth of warriors. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a solution. Greenland was cold, barren, and isolated. Vinland was temperate and overflowing with potential. But Leif didn't colonize it. He didn't claim it. In the name of the king, didn't build a church, and didn't bring a second shipload of settlers. He simply returned to Greenland with a cargo hold full of timber and a story no one could believe was real. Why? The sagas don't say much, but what came next suggests that Leif knew Vinland wasn't empty. Later Norse expeditions led by his brother Thorvald, his sister Fridis, and others would find themselves in violent clashes with the indigenous peoples they called Skrælings. Who these people were is still debated, likely ancestors of modern-day Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, or Inuit. What's clear is that they weren't thrilled about heavily armed strangers showing up with axes and entitlement. Though Leif's expedition saw no bloodshed, he may have sensed that this land was not theirs to take. He didn't attempt conquest. He didn't burn villages. He didn't leave behind a trail of corpses and churches. Instead, he left quietly. Vinland's promise would haunt Norse memory for generations. A land so close, so abundant, yet untouchable. Later voyages would try to settle it, but the tension with the native peoples, the sheer distance from support, and the dangers of overextending meant the idea never stuck. In the end, Leif's discovery was too early. The Norse world wasn't ready. The ocean was too vast, the politics too fragile, and the settlers too few. Vinland faded into legend, part Eden, part ghost, and Leif. He returned to Greenland, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen something no one else had. A world waiting, just not for them. When Leif Erikson returned from Vinland, he didn't come home with gold or glory. He brought something far more controversial, Christianity. Back in Norway, Leif had been baptized under the orders of King Olaf Tryggves, who saw the sword and the cross as equally valid tools for nation building. Leif had accepted the new faith quietly, thoughtfully, without theatrics. But now, with a royal commission and a ship full of priests, he arrived in Greenland as both explorer and evangelist. Greenland, however, had not changed in his absence. The colony was still dominated by Norse paganism. The people still carved runes, drank to Odin, and muttered prayers to Thor during snowstorms. They were settlers, survivors, pragmatic, and fiercely traditional. And they were deeply suspicious of a religion that said all their gods were false and that drinking blood at the winter solstice might be frowned upon. Leif didn't storm temples or burn idols. That wasn't his style. Instead, he used diplomacy, generosity, and the weight of royal backing. He built a church, reportedly the first in Greenland. He gave shelter to priests. He spoke to chiefs, and he told stories, not just of Christ, but of a gentler world beyond ice and exile. His own mother, Theodhild, converted and built a chapel of her own. His father, Erik the Red, famously refused. Erik wanted nothing to do with this new god who didn't enjoy a good blood sacrifice and didn't even fight with a hammer. For Erik, Christianity was weakness. For Leif, it was a path forward. This divide within the family mirrored the larger split in Greenland. Some embraced the faith, seeing it as progress, protection, or just another way to curry favor with the king. Others rejected it as foreign noise. Converts and traditionalists shared stew and suspicion in equal measure. Leif didn't force change. He simply embodied it. He lived as both a Norseman and a Christian, a seafarer and a settler. His quiet strength made him a symbol, not just of faith, but of balance, of evolution, without eraser. He didn't kill the old gods, he just stopped calling on them. And for a colony on the edge of the world, his example was enough to plant the seeds of something new, even if it took generations to grow. Leif Erikson may have carved his own legend across the North Atlantic, but he did so under a long blood-stained shadow. His father's Erik the Red wasn't just infamous. He was practically mythological. A brawler, a settler, a man exiled from Norway and Iceland, who then founded Greenland just to have somewhere new to get kicked out of. Wherever he went, lormen cringed and neighbors kept axes close. His temper was legendary, his charisma even more so. And for Leif, growing up in Erik's household meant learning to balance on a knife's edge between boldness and recklessness, leadership and lunacy. Where Erik was fire, Leif was frost. He didn't bellow. He didn't threaten, but people followed him anyway. The Greenlanders respected his calm. He didn't conquer with a blade, but with direction. And that may have been exactly what the colony needed. But the comparison never faded. Leif returned from Vineland, not drenched in gold, but with timber and tales. His Christian mission in Greenland spread slowly, while Erik sulked and scoffed. The old man had wanted a warrior son to continue his brutal legacy. Instead, he got an explorer, a believer, one who used diplomacy more than steel. Some saw that as weakness, others saw it as wisdom. Leif didn't care. He wasn't trying to outshine Erik. He was simply surviving him. When Erik the Red died, some say from illness, others claim it was a slow defeat of spirit. It marked the end of a certain kind of Norseman. Erik represented the world of old gods, exile, and explosive pride. Leif represented something else, a future that looked beyond icy fjords and blood feuds. In the sagas, their relationship feels strained. Erik resents Leif's new faith. Leif tries to convert him. Neither bends, but there's an undercurrent of respect, even admiration. Erik knew his son wasn't like him, and perhaps deep down he was glad for it. Leif never became king. He never ruled with force, but he outlived his father spiritually and historically. He led Greenland into a new chapter. Less dramatic, maybe, but more sustainable. And sometimes greatness isn't about slaying your father's demons. Sometimes it's about refusing to inherit them. After Vinland, after the church building, after Erik the Red was gone, Leif Erikson didn't chase more glory. He didn't mount a second expedition or try to conquer new lands. Instead, he did something thoroughly un-Viking. He stayed home for the rest of his life. Leif lived in Untitled Greenland, the settlement his father had built. But where Erik ruled with raw authority, Leif governed with a calmer hand. He became chief, yes, but more than that, he became a symbol, not of violence, but of continuity, of quiet leadership in a world that was beginning to change. We don't know much about these later years. The sagas grow vague. His name fades from dramatic action, and instead lingers as a presence. Respected, remembered, but no longer the center of the storm. He raised a family. His son, Thorleifson, would one day lead Greenland. Christianity spread slowly, but steadily. The colony endured, but Vineland, the place that should have changed everything, didn't. Others tried to follow in his wake. His brother Thorvald sailed west and was killed by native resistance. His sister Fridis mounted an expedition filled with treachery, axe murders, and bad decisions. Every attempt to settle Vinland failed, not because the land was lacking, but because the Norse world wasn't ready. Distance, hostility, limited support. Leif knew the risks. That's why he didn't return. He had proven the voyage could be made. He had seen what lay beyond the sea. But he also knew Greenland needed stability more than it needed heroics. In time, Vinland became legend. Half memory, half dream. Some believed it, others didn't. But Leif never shouted his discovery from mountaintops. He never demanded recognition or asked for songs. He didn't need them because he understood something rare. Sometimes making history means knowing when to step back. His final days were likely spent watching the sea, remembering the voyage no one thought possible, and as far as we know, he died in Greenland quietly, peacefully. Not on a battlefield, not on a ship, just at home. Leif Erikson, the explorer who went farther than any Norseman before him, ended his life not chasing the horizon, but anchoring others to it. Leif Erikson may have lived a quiet life in the end, but his story didn't die with him. It mutated, traveled, and multiplied, carried not by historians, but by storytellers. And storytellers, as we know, have a loose relationship with facts. The primary sources for Leif's life, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, were written 2 centuries after he lived. That's like trying to write a biography of Napoleon based on your great-great-grandfather's fishing. Stories. They're dramatic, rich with detail and suspiciously convenient. One saga paints Leif as a kind of Viking missionary spreading Christianity with the calm of a Norse saint. Another shows him as a daring explorer who stumbles into North America because he got lost. Others add side quests, omens, prophetic dreams, whatever made the tale more interesting And then there's Freudis, his sister, sometimes described as a fierce warrior woman who chased off attackers while heavily pregnant, screaming and slapping a sword across her bare chest. Is it true? Possibly not. But would you want to fight her? Definitely not. What's fascinating is how the sagas twist truth and legend into a braid you can't untangle. Leif didn't boast, but his story grew louder with every telling. Over time, he became a symbol of adventure, faith, resilience, a Norseman who dared to sail west before anyone thought it mattered. And then he disappeared again, buried beneath centuries of dust, outshone by louder, bloodier names. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that Leif re-emerged, resurrected by historians eager to find a European who reached America before Columbus. Suddenly, statues appeared. Streets were named. A National Life Erikson Day was declared in the United States. October 9th, based on nothing except immigration paperwork. Ironically, Leif would have hated all the attention. He wasn't seeking fame. He wasn't planting flags. He was doing what Norsemen had always done, sailing into the unknown and bringing back what he could. But history had other plans. And now, the quiet Greenlander who left no books, no speeches, no boasts, is remembered as the man who discovered a continent, even if he never claimed it. Leif Erikson never built an empire. He didn't fight in grand battles. He didn't rule a kingdom or crown himself in gold. And yet he endures, not because he demanded a place in history, but because he quietly earned it. While others chased fame through fire and blood, Leif sailed west into the unknown, guided by curiosity, not conquest. He didn't name himself hero or saint. He didn't erect monuments. He didn't even try to hold the land he found. He simply went, saw, and returned. A rare kind of explorer who didn't need the world to remember his name to justify his journey. And still it did. Leif's legacy lives in stories, in sagas whispered across centuries, reshaped by bards and chroniclers, poets and politicians. The boy from Greenland became a symbol of exploration, resilience, and quiet strength. His journey to Vinland became a chapter in the larger Norse epic, a civilization that dared to sail past the edge of the known world, looking not for war, but for possibility. In the modern age, Leif has taken on a new life. Statues of him stand in Boston, Seattle, Trondheim, and Reykjavik. He's depicted as a proud Norseman gazing westward, hand shielding his brow as if still scanning the horizon for that faint tree-lined shore. Schools bear his name, so do ships, and every October 9th, a few people in America even remember he beat Columbus to the punch by nearly 500 years. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't about discovery or distance. It's about balance. He stood between two worlds, paganism and Christianity, chaos and order, the old gods and a new faith. He didn't force change. He embodied it. He led without shouting. He converted without crusading. He showed that courage isn't always loud, and that history sometimes favors those who simply do the right thing and sail home quietly. Leif Erikson never asked to be remembered, but in a world that often confuses noise for greatness, his story,